real quick. Today, I actually thought I would open with, you get more bear with honey than buckshot. Remember that discussion last week? And that's how we should go after each other. Not that I'm saying we're bears, but at some point in our lives, I guess we may have behaved like bears. Um, but we know that you do get more honey, more bear with honey than you do with buckshot. And I want to say to the person who actually gave me that, I actually have something for that person. And that person may not want to be identified. But I will say that if that person doesn't want to be identified, then I won't identify. Otherwise, I do have a gift for that person. And if that person doesn't want to be identified, then just raise your hand and let me know you don't want to be. Well, you could just simply do a simple nod of your head, yay or nay, and I won't bring you the gift that I have for you. All right, I don't see any response. All right, then I will be walking to give this gift. All right, here we go. Oh, you did. Okay. Now, now that I've opened with that quote, I want to take up where we left off at last week. Um, you remember when we were ending, and I asked you to think about the subject of thinking small. And before that, we were talking about consider one another, be friendly. And you remember I told the story about Jimmy, the pharmacist, and how he trained pharmacists to greet customers within 15 seconds or so of their arrival. And pharmacists are human, just like the rest of us. And at some point in our lives, we avoid direct contact with people, don't we? I remember a friend of mine who was a traffic officer for the city police department, and he actually stopped my son on 2 occasions and wrote him 2 tickets, maybe a month or so apart for whatever. But I asked him, why didn't you give him a warning, or what was your reason for writing him? The violations were not gross. And his response was, when I was talking to him, he wouldn't look at me. And I kind of went sort of, duh. And I said, well, of our 3 children, he is the strongest introvert. And I said, he doesn't look at his mother and I either. But it doesn't make him guilty of anything. It's just his personality. So Jimmy says, when the customer comes in, acknowledge them. Regardless of the reason that you can't give them your immediate attention, acknowledging them is the right thing to do. And it lets them know that you see them, you're aware of their presence, and that most of all, you care. Now, even though you have to wait, a little wave, a comment, a wink, a smile, or a nod says, I see you, you matter. I can't serve you right now, but I respect you and want to help you as soon as possible. And remember, Jimmy said the same thing about church. And he talked about the fact that he and his wife had gone to a church, and that I guess either they went unnoticed for a moment, And they felt it, and we felt the same thing. So be friendly, take advantage of the opportunity because it matters. And we said you don't get a second chance to make a what? First impression. So as difficult as it may be, take advantage of that opportunity at the moment. And I said when we started today, we would talk about be friendly, think small. Be friendly, think small. It's said that satisfaction in marriage has more to do with small acts of attention than big displays of pretension. What do you think that means? Small acts of attention rather than big displays of pretension. Well, it could be the new car that the husband bought for his wife, either for no reason or for a special occasion. And he gave her this great big car and maybe even had the dealer to put a bow on the front of it as it was delivered. But if he doesn't say things like, hi, thank you, I love you, those seemingly little things, how much value does the big thing have? Do you think it's really going to impress her? And it could be the other way around. I'm not being sexist in the sense of he to her, because wives can do the same things, buy big things. But the little things are consideration of one another. I've heard it said that if you want your wife to be royalty at night, then treat her like a queen when you wake up in the morning through the day. And your royalty at night is there. That makes sense? And that may seem like a little thing, but in many ways, it's a big display. One of the things that was given to me from last week, all of us are familiar with the Greek storyteller Aesop, aren't we? I don't think we have anybody in here that's not familiar with Aesop's fables. But this was given to me with regard to our study of considering one another. And this fable from Aesop is entitled The Wind and the Sun. A dispute once arose between the north wind and the sun as to which was the stronger of the two. Seeing a traveler on his way, they agreed to see which could sooner get his cloak off of him. The north wind began and sent a furious blast of air, which at the onset nearly tore the cloak from its fastenings. But the traveler, seizing the garment with a firm grip, held it round his body so tightly that the north wind spent its remaining force in vain. The sun dispelling the clouds that had gathered, then darted his genial beams on the traveler's head. Growing faint with the heat, the man flung off his coat and ran for protection to the nearest shade. What do you think Aesop was trying to say there? Well, in simple terms, and I'm saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words, what he actually said was mildness governs more than anger. Whatever the sun or the wind was attempting to accomplish, they both did it. But the response from the sun was more mild than the response from the wind. the wind and the sun. Mildness governs more than anger. So I appreciate the person who got that to me. Now, going back to thinking small, think small. No extravagant event or expensive present can substitute for the small daily doses of your attention. For instance, think about your children. What could your children buy you that would do more for your heart than those enthusiastic greetings when you come home from work? They're grinning in your presence over some conversation you're having, and they grin from ear to ear, and then they run up to you and leap into your arms. And even as you have come home from work or wherever you've been, and they want to share the news of the day. And if those greetings are precious to you, do you suppose God feels the same way when we greet him? We are his children, aren't we? Doesn't matter how old we get, we're still his children. And when we worship, we're greeting him just as we've done this morning. We're kissing his face with praise, the songs and hymns. Before we rush into the work week, we've done these things. I wonder how he feels, though, when we start our day or our week without speaking to him. Isn't that the essence of the sermon this morning on prayer? It is our pathway to talking to God. If we go through a day and don't talk to God at all, imagine how you would feel if those in your life ignored you or made you invisible for the day. It hurts. And then God is hurt when we do the same thing. Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Imagine the dread of the prodigal son on his long journey home. Was he more concerned about the pain of his humiliation or the pain he inflicted on his father? When we think about it, I think it was the latter. Looking into his father's eyes would be difficult, but they were the eyes the prodigal son needed the most at that time. To see the person who would love him no matter what he had done. The person that he knew would forgive him in spite of the humiliation and the pain that he had brought not only to his life, but on to his father. When he got there, to his surprise, he saw grace from his father rather than judgment. Is that not what we long to see from God when we've messed up? We long for his loving grace, which he gives us. You see, love brightens the eyes and comforts the hearts of those that we greet. They don't have to be strangers. How about the people that we know, the people that we are around on a regular basis? Love brightens their eyes and comforts them when we exchange those greetings. After Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, what did they do? They went and hid. Do we know that feeling? After you were baptized, maybe it was only a short time till you realized, thinking about your past sins, it's kind of like even in childhood, when our children do wrong, we can sense something is wrong because what? They kind of turn away from us, don't they? And maybe the same thing happens even as adults when we either have wronged or been wronged by someone else. We have that feeling of discomfort as we approach those people. You know, and you may have that feeling inside, no matter how hard you tried to get away, you would feel awful. But before long, maybe that person made their way to you and broke the ice, knocked that wall of discomfort down. And suddenly you felt this encouragement. Was that hard to do? In our humanness, it may be hard to do, but it is necessary for us to be considerate of one another's feelings. Um, all of us have been at that point at some time in our life when we kind of sense the remorse of something that had happened, and it just seems that it keeps piling on and on and on. And it reaches a point where instead of smiling to greet someone, you kind of avoid them, go around so you don't have to face that. But we know that in our experiences in life that we cannot avoid forever. At some point, we have to face it head on. We have to find the will to press on. And Paul said this in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2. He said, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. What he's saying is that expressions of disapproval are necessary when a person will not admit wrongdoing. But censure, and sometimes we may not realize it, that we're censuring the person. And the detrimental part of this is that people can become crushed because of our censure. And sometimes we have to remember who we are as God's children, as his people, as his instruments and tools in our relationships and our interactions one with another. If we cannot love and affirm those who have stumbled and sinned, then Christianity is a fraud. We say we're Christians. We must be considerate of one another. And somehow we must find the courage to be considerate in spite of stumbling blocks that may be there. We know that penitence is crucial if we're going to be comfortable in our relationship with God. We know that sin can't be ignored. But what people usually need is simple, basic encouragement to do what is required and expected of us as God's children. You know, sometimes we may go a little too far in that we may want to pile it on in rebuking that person who is struggling with guilt-ridden behavior for whatever the reason. And it's like, at that point, we're giving a drowning man a drink of water. That's one way maybe to look at it. We're pouring on where someone else is already struggling. The question is this: how can we save souls if we don't care enough to comfort hearts? I'll ask it again. How can we save souls if we do not care enough to comfort the hearts of those who need encouragement? If I don't care about your humanity, why should I concern myself with your eternity? People listen when they feel loved. And we have to sometimes restore that loving care and relationship between us and other people. When you see me, understand me, and feel me in your heart, then you've earned the right to be heard, but not until then. And that's what people are saying inside of themselves. You've ignored me. You don't see me. The day is fast approaching, people, when you and I will be greeted by Jesus himself. What are the words that we want to hear? Depart from me. None of us want to hear that. We want to hear the welcome from Jesus and the words of well done, well done. So when Jesus comes, he and his angels will greet us, and he will claim his followers, and he'll usher us into eternity with him. Then you'll be greeted by God as you stand before his glorious throne. He will not ignore you or brush you off as he rushes to handle more interesting or pressing concerns. That moment of joy will surpass every earthly delight and every cause. All past sufferings will fade into memory. But never forget that every good thing you have become, every noble thing you've done, and every wonderful thing you will enjoy throughout eternity all began when someone who loved Jesus first spoke one simple word to you. Hello. Hi. Greetings. Welcome. Those are the things that will get us to eternity. May seem small, but they're big in God's eyes. What's our first responsibility as a Christian? Matthew 25:40, to sense the needs of those around us. What proves whether God's love is in our hearts comes from 1 John chapter 3, verse 17. Loving in action, not just in words. Romans 16:16 tells us with this question, what crowning command concludes Paul's letter to the church at Rome? In Romans 16:16, he opens with, greet one another. Greet one another. Matthew 7:16, what is the fruit of love in its most basic form? What is the fruit of love in its most basic form? Matthew 7:16 tells us that it is a simple, sincere greeting. And lastly, Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. How did the Apostle Paul say we fulfill the law of Christ? By bearing one another's burdens. Consider one another. That's how we do it. Now, moving on, we've got a little time left to get into this. I want to move on now to being compassionate. Be compassionate. John Wooden said this. He said, you cannot live a perfect day without doing something for someone who will never be able to repay you. Let me share that again. You cannot live a perfect day without doing something for someone who will never be able to repay you. What does it mean? Right now, this congregation is in the process of collecting school supplies for the Africa Backpack Project that Dorian Flynn has asked us to participate in. Not a one of us will get at least an opportunity that I know of and I can imagine in life to meet any of those children that will be receiving those backpacks. You cannot live a perfect day without doing something for someone who will never be able to repay you. Those children may not be able to repay us directly, but the mere fact that Dorian Flynn and the mission there is working with them, teaching them the gospel, we will benefit from it by those who accept, surrender themselves through baptism to Christ. We may not be alive to ever know what they've accomplished. We may not receive a thank you note from either one of them. You cannot live a perfect day without doing something for someone who will never be able to repay you. I see Peggy, then Danny.
None of that matters if you're true in your heart and you love the people. Whatever you do it without anyone to any repay from anything.
Thank you. Peggy said, you did it in essence because it was the right thing to do, and you were not looking for a pat on the back or any other self-gratification from it. Okay, Danny?
Jesus lays this out in Luke 14, plainly, right? Verse 12. But he also went on to say to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, and do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your neighbors, otherwise they may also invite you in return that you will have your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of life.
Absolutely. Thank you, Danny. So rather than looking for in the hand right now, do the right thing for your reward in judgment. Thank you.
Your rewards in heaven.
Absolutely. The reward that you should be seeking is that from heaven. And if you're looking for something, maybe humanly, Lord, thank you for blessing me to be able to do good for someone else, to help someone else who does not have what I was able to help them to receive. Thank you for blessing me and helping me to bless others. I want to go on to a story, and it's called Bernie's Call. Bernie's Call. On a cold February day in 1952, a distress call came to the Coast Guard station in Chatham, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. During one of the worst storms ever to hit the East Coast, the SS Pendleton oil tanker was ripped in half, yet somehow remained afloat. It was only a matter of time until she was going down. More than 30 sailors were trapped on board with no way to save themselves. Most of the life station crew were gone when the call came. They were on a rescue mission to another foundering tanker, the SS Fort Mercer. Bernie Weber, one of the few remaining crewmen, was ordered by the station commander to pick a crew and take the remaining lifeboat to rescue the stranded sailors on the swiftly sinking Pendleton. The sandbar between the Chatham Harbor and the open sea is hazardous to navigate even under the best of circumstances. Now the storm was kicking up giant waves. Many considered the rescue operation foolhardily, but Bernie Weber would not be deterred. Men were counting on him to cross over and come to their aid. He knew he was their only hope of survival. Timing the burst of his engine to meet the battering waves, Bernie crossed the bar successfully, but lost his compass in the jostling. Refusing to turn back, he steered in the general direction of the tanker, and he did find his needle in a haystack. His small lifeboat was designed to carry 12 people. But unwilling to leave any man behind, Bernie managed to get 32 sailors on his craft. Shortly after the last man came aboard, the Pendleton sunk and went down. For his heroism, Bernie and his crew were awarded the gold life-saving medals. And I wrote this question afterward: did they do it for the medals? What do you think? No, they didn't do it for the medals. They did it because they cared. Were their lives in jeopardy and peril? Absolutely. Did that turn them back? No. Their craft could only accommodate, what did I say, a dozen, 16 people maybe? Or 12 people? But there were 32 people there. And Bernie never said, okay, to my crew, you all jump overboard, we wish you well. Bernie found a way to get these 32 people on that craft, even with his crew. Bernie and the crew demonstrated compassion. Compassion. That's comparable to the same compassion that the Apostle Paul demonstrated, looking at Acts chapter 2. The Apostle Paul was at Troas when a distress call arrived in the form of a night vision. Paul saw a man of Macedonia standing and urging him. Acts chapter 16, verse 9 says, he urged him, come over to Macedonia and help us. When the Apostle Paul saw the vision, he didn't hesitate to answer the summons. Immediately, he and his life-saving crew, if you would, made arrangements to go directly to Macedonia. Paul knew that he knew God was calling him to preach the gospel to desperate men who could not save themselves. And Paul knew that the gospel was their only hope. Paul demonstrated compassion along with his obligation and commitment as a disciple and apostle to answer the call. Be compassionate. What is your call? What is my call? We've shared these seafaring stories that remind us of the familiar hymn by the writer and author Charles Gabriel. And he wrote the song that we sing today that's called Send the Light. And we know that in the lyrics of this song, it says, there's a call comes ringing o'er the restless wave. Send the light. Send the light. There are souls to rescue. There are souls to save. Send the light. Send the light. And going back to Bernie Weber, just as Bernie crossed over the bar and just as Paul crossed the Aegean Sea, you and I must be willing to cross over any barrier to reach the lost. Sometimes those obstacles are not necessarily 10-foot waves in a storm. Sometimes those obstacles are social, emotional, rather than physical. In the final verse of Charles Gabriel's song, it challenges the worshipers. It says this in the lyrics, let us not grow weary in the work of love. You see, the work of Christians is to show the world, to show our neighbors the love of Jesus. This is done partly through words, but it's also done through deeds. But there is a problem. Before I can love you, I must first risk getting to know you. Love is about filling human needs. And if I am to know what you need, I must get close enough to you to find out what those needs are. I must cross over in the storm, just as Paul did, and just as Mr. Weber did. How do we do that? If you want to turn your Bibles, and you don't have to, Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37. And it's something we've actually talked about in this study over the past couple of weeks, but also lessons from the pulpit. Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37. The parable of the Good Samaritan. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You've answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, You go and do likewise. Be compassionate. Have the courage to cross over. In this parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus celebrated the courage of a considerate man who dared to love a stranger in need. The key phrase in the story is the other side. Go back to our own childhood. Remember, as kids, we understood the sanctity of my side. Whether you were a child or you were a parent and you got in the car to go somewhere, what's the first thing? Mom, tell him get off my side. Oh, I was riding shotgun. You can't take my seat. So we kind of grow up with a sense of a side, the other side. As adults, we get familiar with my side of the church auditorium, or my row, or my seat. Could you imagine you came in and there were visitors sitting in your seat? Excuse me, that's my seat. Would you move? We wouldn't dare do that. At some point, it's no longer rational. When conflict arises, we defend my side of the debate. The other side is your side. And that's where I must go to understand your feelings. That's where I must go to discover your needs. Until someone crosses over, there will not be a connection between you and me. Crossing over can be challenging. For some, it can be worrisome. And frankly, we're always more comfortable on our own side, aren't we? But knowing human nature and our reluctance to cross over, Jesus told a compelling story to help us experience the blessings of charity and intimacy. The alternative is an insular life of laziness and selfishness, and oddly, a life of self-centeredness can be disguised as a life of religious devotion. And notice I said disguised. Jesus knew that the most religious are often the least likely to cross over. He's encouraging you and me to be the good Samaritan, to be considerate of one another, and have the courage to cross over. Danny?
I've taught the youth the Good Samaritan many times about talking about love and things like that. And that I was thinking about it before you read it. That is Jesus is so clever whenever he answers these questions where they try and trick him.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't just say, the guy was expecting him to say, all right, the lawyer, my neighbor, okay, my family. But what Jesus did, not just a man on the side of the road, but a man that the Samaritan and that man would have not ever talked to one another or got along. They would have been mortal enemies, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus even takes it as far enough to say, hey, these guys would have been friends, and he still sacrificed his own time, his own safety on that road, his own money. Jesus used all the extreme points to show his iniquity.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Absolutely. And, even today, we're still challenged with the difficulties that the Good Samaritan was able to overcome by having the courage to cross over. We're challenged in our lives regularly. And I hope we have the courage to cross over when we can. Lord willing, next week we'll continue. And we've just talked about crossing over, but I want us to think about the occasion after we cross over for next week. Thank you for your time. Have a blessed day and a blessed week.